brutality and bloodshed will not survive. It's not too late for the military to reverse the negative trajectory on the ground, exercise restraint, and respect the will of its own people. We must raise our voices for those who have been silenced, detained, injured, or killed. We must be ardent advocates for the protection of all fundamental human rights, including the rights to freedom of expression, access to information, and of peaceful assembly, which have been repeatedly infringed upon by the military-led authorities.
Damien Kingsbury is a professor in political science at Deakin University in Australia. He's also led a team of international observers to Myanmar's 2015 elections, and he joins us live now. Professor, while good in theory, is the General Assembly's message going to have any impact on the junta's actions on the ground?
It's a moral victory for the pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, but it's unlikely to have any practical impact on the ground in Myanmar. The junta is just going to ignore this. And given that it's backed by China and Russia in terms of its arms supplies, it has a capacity to ignore the United Nations and to ignore those countries which voted in favour of this move.
A moral victory for the protesters, you say, and they are continuing, albeit on a much smaller scale. Do you think that they will continue to have the energy to continue these protests, or are they going to be running out of steam?
Well, as you say, the protests are starting to decline in terms of numbers and frequency. They are very much likely to continue, but we've seen a move towards many of the protesters leaving the towns and cities and joining up with the armed non-government actors, of which there are a number in Myanmar, particularly the Kachin and the Karen National Union. And I think that in a way replicates events after 1988, after a similar coup in which there was widespread massacres. Now, the consequences of that, and again in this case, are that whilst we're likely to see a stiffening of resolve against the military, it's unlikely to actually unseat the military. The military is simply too powerful. It has over 400,000 soldiers under arms. It has very modern equipment. It continues to be supplied by China and Russia, and it simply has the capacity to withstand both any civilian unrest, any armed activism within the country, and certainly any moral persuasion by the United Nations.
With that in mind then, Professor, what happens from here? How do you see this playing out?
Well, my guess is that the West will increase sanctions against the military, against the generals, against the companies that are owned by the military, that they will be careful in applying sanctions which hurt ordinary Myanmar people, but will try to target the junta in particular. That's not really going to have a major impact, though, given that China has come in behind the junta very strongly, very firmly, in terms of economic support and, as I say, provision of weapons. So I think we're going to be in for a very long haul, probably replicating in many respects the events after 1988, where it really took well over a decade before there was even any discussion about loosening up restrictions and heading towards some sort of semi-democratic process. It's very likely that we're in for another decade or two of military rule in Myanmar. I can't see the military stepping back at this stage. They've invested too much too far, and to bow out at this stage would leave them vulnerable to prosecution by civilian authorities, and they certainly don't want that.
It's quite the dire outlook. Professor Damien Kingsbury from Deakin University in Australia, thank you very much for your analysis.